If you have a policy solution that just says, nope, you got to do it this way, then you don't get that experimentation. You don't get that trial and error process playing out. And so it's really difficult to be confident ex post that you actually got it right.
I mean, there's a meme on Bitcoin Twitter, which is, I just discovered Bitcoin and I'm here to fix it. There's no reason to think that policymakers are immune from that meme.
If the probability that coins have come from a breach and fraud increase, then so too has the probability that some legal authority is going to step in and say, you have to return these to their rightful owner.
If lots of people around the world are using Bitcoin and day-to-day transactions, you're going to have these other solutions, and you're going to have people interacting outside of the base layer.
Hey everyone, I'm Renee Sorchik, the VP of Research at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, and today I'm here with Dr. Joshua Hendrickson, Professor of Economics and the Chair of the Economics Department at the University of Mississippi, and Dr. Will Luther, an Associate Professor and Graduate Director of Economics Department at Florida Atlantic University. Will's also the Director of the American Institute for Economic Research Sound Money Project. And today we're going to talk about your very exciting paper that you released at our Policy Summit, titled Fullness, Security, and the Price of Bitcoin. So Bitcoiners, we often think about block size maybe as an inconvenience or a problem that we need to fix or overcome, but your research actually suggests that it may be a hidden security feature, and that when blocks are congested, it might be harder and obviously more costly for criminals to launder stolen coins. So that might mean fewer hacks and frauds during times of high traffic. And interestingly, it sounds like you also found a strong correlation with the price of Bitcoin. So maybe to get started, I would love to hear how you first thought about this. Like, what got you thinking about block size and security and kind of the correlation and the link between the two?
Well, the one answer is that I'm just always thinking about when is a good time to rob a bank. And the answer to that is when you can get away with it. Fortunately, I guess for my family, I've never been so delusional to think that I can get away with it, so I haven't robbed the bank. But that's the basic idea here, right? Is that you got to make a getaway. And if you don't expect that you're going to be able to successfully make a getaway, then you're not going to rob the bank. Now, the more truthful answer here is that I have a bright graduate student, Zach Glatzer, who was my master's student here at FAU. And then when he finished his master's degree, went on to the PhD program. And a couple years ago, he was visiting at the American Institute for Economic Research over the summer. And we were talking about some stuff that he had been thinking about. And he had been thinking about questions about congestion, right? And he had some interesting breach and fraud data. And so we went back through some iterations and then thought we would take a look at this particular idea.
And so, I mean, I guess I have a couple of questions around this. I'm curious, is it that, like what's to stop someone from robbing a bank or just performing cyber criminal activities and then sitting on it? Because in some ways it's counterintuitive. I would think you would want to hide in like a full block. Maybe people wouldn't see you trying to launder transactions as much or getting things through. But is what you're finding, in order to be successful and get away with it, you really have to turn those things around quickly, like right away, immediately? Or what's to stop someone from maybe just kind of sitting there for a while and then, doing things over time?
Yeah, so I think that what you're really trying to do, right, is that if you're going in, well, I mean, one thing is that oftentimes, these breaches, like of a, if you were to breach an exchange and you were to steal some of their coins, right, oftentimes, like, the hacker doesn't necessarily even want the coins themselves, right? Like, they just want whatever domestic currency that they're using. And so one thing that they're trying to do is they want to convert this to something else. And I think like the public nature of the blockchain is kind of what flips this on its head, right? So if I take these if I take these coins, if I want to get rid of them, I almost have to try to do this in a timely fashion, because the longer I sit on them, the more that people know that, like, hey, those are those coins. And so maybe that doesn't matter necessarily to the other users, or maybe it does. But it's certainly going to matter to law enforcement and things like that. And so ideally, what you would want to do is you would want to be able to sort of get the coins from your heist, right? And then figure out a way to then turn that into the money that you want, without anybody being able to realize that it was you who took those coins, because you're trying to not only turn what you've stolen into some other form of money, but you're also at the same time you're trying to hide the fact that it's you. And so the quicker that you can make transactions to kind of break those probability models of law enforcement, like the better chance that you have of actually getting away with it without being identified.
Yeah. So, for example, suppose you're an above board exchange, right? And someone comes to you and says, we just acquired all of this Bitcoin through a hack, and we'd like to exchange that for dollars, right? As an above board exchange, you would probably say, no, thank you. This is going to be a huge headache when our regulator finds out that we knowingly helped you launder the proceeds of this hack. Suppose that you're not an above board exchange, right? Maybe you're willing to engage in a questionable transaction like this. Seems plausible to think that you would be more willing to engage in this kind of a transaction if you had some plausible deniability. If you could say, well, it turns out these were the funds from a hack, but we didn't know that at the time. But if the hack has been publicized and folks have already traced those transactions through the block, then there goes that plausible deniability, right? Folks know that you know where these funds came from. And so our assumption is that the quicker you try to launder these proceeds, the more likely you are to be successful. The more likely you are to find an exchange that will be able to convert those funds for you. The more willing exchanges will be, either knowingly or unknowingly, the quicker you try to execute that exit.
And so ultimately the idea that maybe these full blocks, block congestion, is less associated with breaches comes down to greed, that the criminals don't want to pay the high fees, or are there other factors as well?
Could be fees. It could be time. It could be time sensitive. So, you can always pay higher and higher fees to get into a block, but also at the same time, if you're drawing attention to yourself if you have to offer, very, very high fees to get your transaction into a block. And so that's the critical point, is that these people are operating on a public blockchain and trying to be unidentifiable. And the other people who are also using this blockchain are going to have knowledge of breaches. They're going to have knowledge that, exchanges were hacked, and they're going to be looking for these things. The same thing with law enforcement, right? They might be looking for these, like, okay, somebody hacked this major exchange. Let's see if we can track down who those people are. If you're doing very large transactions and you're paying very high fees for those transactions to make sure that they go through much more quickly, first of all, you're losing some of the proceeds of what you stole by paying those fees. But then also at the same time, you're potentially calling attention to yourself by offering an exorbitant fee to try to get your transaction through immediately.
That makes sense. Is this something that's unique to Bitcoin, or do we see any parallels in traditional finance, where maybe there's certain frictions that deter crimes?
Well, there are some parallels. And I guess this gets at, we want to recognize negatives as negatives and positive as positives, right? We're certainly not saying here that like congestion is a great thing. We all should just celebrate congestion and not look for ways of alleviating congestion. But we also want to recognize that there are some trade-offs here, and in some cases, criminals may bear the burden of that congestion more so than others, and so there's a sort of an upside to an otherwise negative thing. Um, One area where there's a pretty clear link to traditional finance is traditional finance doesn't typically have real time payments, right? Oftentimes, if you swipe your debit card, that may look instantaneous to you, but your bank is actually in many cases waiting a bit before those funds are transferred from from one bank to another, right, on the back end. So it's not your bank, but the merchant's bank. But there are some places that have rolled out real-time payments, and one place is Brazil. And one of the things that they found when they rolled out those real-time payments is that suddenly there was a rise in crime, in a particular type of crime, the kind of crime where you kidnap someone, take them to an ATM, and then have them transfer money to your account. That is not the kind of crime that works out very well when it takes 3 days for a payment to clear. Um, Assuming that you're not talking about a value sufficient to take someone's life for, right? If you're just thinking about petty crimes, right? You're going to leave that person, and then they're going to have 2 days and 23 hours to stop this transaction, right? But if you have real-time payments, then it's already too late to stop this transaction. The money has already moved, and indeed, you probably have someone else ready to receive and then send on that money. And it just makes that kind of crime much more viable when you have real-time payments. And that's what happened in Brazil, an uptick in that kind of crime.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard about that, but it makes perfect sense. Maybe you guys want to talk a little bit about your maybe not too much in the weeds of the details, but the data. So, you ran some complex regression models. That's probably beyond the scope of this webinar, but what did you see in terms of, your data suggested that these criminals are timing their illicit activities with low block congestion. How strong was that relationship, or, how significant did you find these things to be?
Well, let me say one thing about one of the empirical approaches that we took here. We had to use for some robustness checks. We used a rare events model, and the reason we have to use a rare events model is because these breaches and frauds are very rare. Right? They don't happen that often, and I think that when you're talking to non-Bitcoiners, there's this idea that it's the Wild West and these sorts of things are just always occurring, and how could you ever trust that your Bitcoin is secure? But in fact, empirically, in order to get a clear view of what's going on here, we couldn't just use the standard approach. We had to use a rare events approach here to be sure about it, because these events are very rare.
That makes sense. Josh, do you want to comment on the relationship between?
No, and I just think that, the really surprising thing here is I think that when we kind of started this out, like the hypothesis certainly seemed like reasonable, right? But at the same time, because these are like such rare things, that was sort of a concern, is like, even if our hypothesis was correct, would we actually find evidence that it was correct, just because they're so rare, right? And so there just might not be enough data to do it. I think, to me, kind of the fascinating thing about it is, I think this gave this kind of gave me like new perspective, because I think like for example, like during the Blocksize Wars, there were these debates about, should we increase the block size? And I remember like early on as an economist, the people who were advocating like big blocks were, making arguments about, they were really making arguments about Bitcoin's future, right? It was like, oh, well, in the future, if this is going to be this payments technology that everybody's using, we're going to have to process a lot more payments. And if we're going to have to process a lot more payments, then we need bigger blocks. And as an economist, like early on, I was kind of thinking like, yeah, that makes sense. And so initially, like what I expected, like the small block case to kind of be is that, is that like, well, we could always do that later, right? Like we don't have to do that now. Like that's kind of what I anticipated that it would be, but that was not really what it was about at all. Like, and it was an incredible like learning experience for me because I started getting the perspective of all of these like developers and people like that who were saying, no, this is actually about being able to like run a node and do all of these things that we value. But I think that this kind of made me think a little bit about that as well, is that if we had actually gone through with the big blocks, would that have actually made these things more likely to occur just because there conceivably would have been a lot more opportunities to do that. And so I think for me, like kind of the interesting thing about the result is that, whenever you're looking at rare events, like finding a result, finding an empirical result is difficult to begin with, just because you're focusing on these rare events. But then also the fact that we did find something sort of convinced me to kind of reflect on the Blocksize War from another perspective, which is that could have been I think we all kind of recognize now that like the right decision was made, and the small blockers won, and it was
certainly it's won the market test.
Yeah, it won the market test, right? And so, but this kind of adds a little bit to it, which is that had that been done, it could have been a lot worse than even people who were against it, might have imagined, because it might have encouraged more of this type of behavior, because it would have been much easier to potentially launder this stuff through all kinds of different addresses or something until it became untraceable. And then in which case, there'd be greater rewards for hacking exchanges and things of that nature.
It might be also worth noting, Josh and I, we're not getting any younger. And when we have conversations about things like the Blocksize War, it probably makes us look very old. Maybe some of your viewers / listeners are too young, perhaps even just in their exposure to Bitcoin to know what we're talking about when we're talking about the Blocksize War, right? It seems like so long ago now. But there's a great book on this called The Blocksize War, highly recommend, that will bring you up to speed if you're not familiar with what that big debate was all about, and how it got settled the way that it did. So sorry if we're taking too much for granted there.
No, I mean, Josh, I think he summed it up pretty high level nicely. The people were worried about transaction throughputs and wanted bigger block size, right? But then ultimately that is challenging for running a node long term. And so the smaller block size advocates won. And actually, it's interesting that your research kind of strengthens that stance, right? That there is a security issue in having this smaller block size. And maybe that's an important factor people hadn't really considered before. So, and I mean, that also, going forward, if there were ever, if Bitcoin becomes a major payment system and maybe nation states are using it or whatnot, and there is advocacy for kind of increasing throughput or capacity, and maybe policymakers actually say, okay, no, actually, we need to fix this. We need to make a law or something. I think that is a good case to come back to and say, okay, yeah, but there's trade-offs to this, right? So you got to think about the security side of things, and we can point to your paper. So I don't know if something like that were to happen down the road, what would be your kind of commentary to policymakers if for some reason they were advocating for this less congestion, higher block size, more transactions?
Well, I think if you think about what Josh said earlier about, his initial view, which by the way was my initial view as well, right? It was pretty clear there was a congestion problem There weren't great solutions at the time. It's easy to see how someone might think that that's a good solution. Josh is a very smart guy, right? Much smarter than many, may I say most, perhaps all policymakers. We just have to, in that policymaking process, a big dose of humility is in order. There are things that you can be wrong about. And the difference between policy and decentralized decision making is that policy, in many ways, it's like a one size fits all solution, right? If you get it right, great, you got it right. But if you get it wrong, then it's completely wrong for all of us, right? There's no experimentation there if you have that policy decision. There's no opportunity to try something else. And I think part of the reason why we can be much more confident today than we could have been when the Blocksize War was really waging is because we saw those experiments. They happened, right? Different people, different groups tried different things. And some of those things worked out great and others not so much. And, we see where the chips fell. But if you have a policy solution that just says, nope, you got to do it this way, then you don't get that experimentation. You don't get that trial and error process playing out. And so it's really difficult to be confident ex post that you actually got it right. You got it, but you don't know if you got it right.
Well, I think this is also gets to kind of the core of Bitcoin to begin with, is that part of that victory is kind of even more important now. And one of the reasons it's more important now is that, back in, 2017, we weren't really worried about, the government's going to want to have they're going to try to influence the block size or something like that. We essentially assumed at that time, that at best the government just wouldn't care. And at worst that they would actually just try to attack Bitcoin and destroy it before it really ever took off. And I think that in this case, now we actually have to wrestle with this, is that as more and more countries embrace Bitcoin, policymakers are very unlikely to just sit on the sidelines and not say anything or have opinions about Bitcoin. They're much more likely to have opinions about Bitcoin now, and they're much more likely to, there's a meme on Bitcoin Twitter, which is, I just discovered Bitcoin and I'm here to fix it. And and there's no reason to think that policymakers are immune from that meme. And I think that we have to be, cognizant of that, because as more and more governments actually take an interest in Bitcoin, they might ultimately want to have a say. But this kind of gets back to what was essential about that debate and why it was so important that the small blockers won, is that by having smaller blocks, you have more people who can run their own node. And if you can run your own node, you can essentially vote with your node. If somebody wants to change and make, big blocks, you can keep, running the existing core software. You don't have to, you don't have to switch. You don't have to make that jump. And so that in and of itself is valuable for these kinds of debates, because it limits the ability of policymakers to manipulate things. Is they can't just they can't just say it has to be a particular way, because people can simply choose not to follow them in that direction. But also, as it relates to our paper, anybody who tries to change it, this is yet another reason that people can use to say, no, there's an importance of having smaller blocks, and that you actually have to understand this. And so in addition to reading the Blocksize War and understanding a lot of these technological issues and self-sovereignty issues, you should also understand that this is going to potentially open up avenues for crime and fraud and things like that that could potentially be motivated by having too large of transaction blocks. And so I think that is another thing that you can use to kind of push those politicians in the right direction, and also to sort of discourage them from trying to make changes, because as Bitcoiners like to say, everything is an attack on Bitcoin. But I think that politicians trying to influence the code is an actual legitimate attack on Bitcoin. And so you want to have the best arguments to go with that, because I do think that those days are potentially coming with more and more politicians taking an interest.
Yeah, nation state adoption is growing, so that it is definitely a risk. So I would say someone might look at this and they might say, well, how do you know it's not, that these breaches and these frauds happen? Think of like FTX, and everyone got scared away, and that's what's actually causing the smaller block size, right? And so you do some work in your paper to show causality, and I wonder if maybe we could get into that a little bit, or do you think maybe it's too technical, deep in the weeds, but like how you use SegWit to kind of show causality around that? Actually, no, it is like there is a correlation between like this, like criminals are performing activities when the blocks are less congested versus like the other way around, right? Do you think that's something they could go over at a high level, or is it too much in the weeds?
Yeah, I think, as economists, we're kind of always looking for exogenous variation. You want to mitigate things like selection effects. In the natural sciences and medicine, they have, pretty clear ways of doing that, right? You give one patient the treatment drug and another a placebo. And if you do that, then you can be sure that any observed difference in the group that got the treatment and the group that got the placebo is actually caused by the treatment drug, right? In the social sciences, that's much harder. We as you note, we have this idea that congestion has this effect, but there are things causing congestion. And it may be that whatever's causing congestion is also causing, the relationship with breaches and frauds that we're finding. So you want some exogenous variation in your congestion, right? Some change in congestion that is not due to anything related to breaches and frauds. And the SegWit effectively does that. So that's really what we're doing there.
And do you want to summarize real quickly what you found?
Yeah, so basically the idea is that, SegWit does open up more block space, right? And so by opening up more block space, then if our theory is correct, right, then if we isolate the time periods around SegWit, then we should expect to see some of these breaches and frauds occur sort of in that aftermath of the change, just because there is this new kind of exogenous variation. Now, I mean, it's a little bit complicated because not everybody adopts it at the same time. So we kind of have like a time period around this to try to capture a sufficient amount of time to where, enough people maybe have switched that if you're using those addresses, you can maybe go a little faster or something. But what we basically found is that, yeah, like after the introduction, we do find evidence of that. We do find evidence of more breaches and frauds than we would have expected, given like the pre-SegWit data. And so based on that, we interpret that as providing some degree of evidence that, hey, when you introduce this sort of exogenous change to block size, you did actually see this change in breaches and frauds. And so if you observe that, like, it's hard to say that that's reverse causation or that it's caused by some other thing that's causing, both things to change, because it's sort of, in a way, it's like a natural experiment, right? Like we didn't get to design the experiment, but there is this sort of change that happens at a particular date, and so we can kind of see, okay, does what happens after the date look like we would have predicted given what we knew before that date? And so the fact that we find evidence of an increased probability of breaches and frauds kind of gives us some indication that we've got the direction of causation correct.
And let me just add that it's kind of amazing that we found evidence here, because as Josh and I have both said earlier, that the breaches and frauds are just so rare to begin with, right? Anytime you are, like exploiting a natural experiment to get at causality, you have a very limited window. You're going to look at a very short period of time before the change and a very short period of time after the change. And so you might very well be concerned that because that empirical approach requires limiting the window, that you might just not get any breaches and frauds because they're so rare, even if the probability of breaches and frauds has increased, right? And so actually finding the evidence that the probability of breaches and frauds have increased is, from an empirical perspective, incredible, because again, there's a very good chance that you don't see that evidence, even if it's true, just because you have such a small window within which to observe that actually occurring. So again, really just points at this idea that we seem to have gotten the causality right.
Yeah, it's a very clever way of showing causality. I love it. I also want to get into price a little bit, because that was another main finding of the paper, and I think it's really important that when you see this increased congestion, the price goes up. And so you're positing that the increase in price during high congestion is because people are trusting the coins more. And I'm wondering if maybe you can unpack that a little bit, as I think, like me as Renee, if I'm like going to buy coins, I never think about like, oh, maybe they could be stolen or whatever. I guess I'm on an exchange or I'm doing whatever. But is it more, are you thinking more like BlackRock or these kind of big entities like that maybe they care more and they're thinking about this? Or like maybe you can just tell me a little bit more about the idea and kind of the research and what you found behind this.
Yeah, so the basic idea, and to be clear, it's kind of a subsidiary idea to our primary focus on the effect of congestion on breaches and frauds. But the basic idea is that if the probability that coins have come from a breach and fraud increase, then so too has the probability that some legal authority is going to step in and say, you have to return these to their rightful owner. And there's of course some disagreement about whether or not that can actually be done in practice. Some people are more inclined to believe than others that Bitcoin is kind of outside of the legal realm. And as long as you have your keys in your head, then no one can force you to hand those balances over. But most of us aren't interested in going to prison with the keys in our head. And so there is some very real world pressure that can be applied to convince people to hand over those keys. So, the idea there is that the more confident you are that that's not going to happen to you, then the more you're willing to pay, or the closer to your estimate of the true value of these coins you're going to be willing to pay. And correspondingly, if you think there's some tiny probability that you will inadvertently accept some coins that have been acquired by breach or fraud, then you'll want to discount how much you're willing to pay for those coins relative to your assessment of their true value. And as in many markets, most of us are what economists would call price takers, right? When I go to the store, I'm not trying to negotiate over the price of bread or anything like that. The price of bread is what it is, and I have to make my decisions accordingly. But there are some very big players who have some pricing power. And of course, there are decisions on the margin we can make, like whether to buy bread or not buy bread, and also whether to exchange for coins now or exchange for coins later. And those decisions can have some effect on the price, particularly when lots and lots of small people are moving in the same direction, or when a very big player is making that decision consciously.
Well, and the other thing, I mean, is like the one way to interpret like the empirical results is that, a challenge here is like, how do you test this, right? Because if you're trying to test it, full blocks reduce the probability that somebody might, engage in a breach or a fraud. Like that's our hypothesis, right? But full block, and so that might give you greater, confidence. But the thing is that full blocks might also just reflect the fact that like lots of people are using Bitcoin. And if lots of people are using Bitcoin, Bitcoin's more valuable. And so if Bitcoin's more valuable, like how do we know? And so the thing in the paper that we do is we control for all of these different aspects of, I guess, what you would call network effects, right? So we try to control for all of those other things. And so in doing so, the sort of effect of the relative like fullness of the block is the effect that's independent of all of those other network effects. And so if this was all just network effects, what we would expect is that, well, once we control for all those other things, then the statistical relationship between block size and price would disappear, and it doesn't disappear. And so that's kind of leads us to believe that, the risk of these things might be affecting people's valuation, right? And not only for like what Will is saying, but if you're, we also have to think about this broad time period here, right? Like that I think if we think about it in the world that we live in right now with Coinbase or something like that, or Gemini or these large, companies, it's a little bit different than in the old days, right? Because in the old days, a breach and a fraud could just shut down the exchange. And so it's not just that they stole the exchange's Bitcoin, they stole your Bitcoin. And so if you are storing it on the exchange, if there's a bunch of empty blocks and that encourages people to try to steal from exchanges and sell them rapidly, well, if you're holding your Bitcoin on an exchange, your Bitcoin is at risk there, in a very, very tangible way, right? So the exchange might just up and disappear the following day, right? Somebody stole our coins, we're really sorry, and then they're just gone. Well, to think that that's not going to affect your demand for Bitcoin, I think is a little bit naive, right? I think if people are in that sort of environment, they're going to think to themselves like, okay, if I buy this and I leave this on the exchange, what's the likelihood that this exchange gets hacked? What's the likelihood that I actually like lose this stuff? I think that's we might not think about that as much because in compared to earlier days, I think that now exchanges are like publicly traded corporations, and so their legal liability is a little bit different than when you had these sort of fly by night exchanges just operating on the internet and with questionable legal responsibilities should something happen to your coins. And so I think that that's kind of an important element of this as well, is that risk is very real to people, and it might affect people's demand. And to the extent it affects their demand, it's going to affect the price.
And maybe in the same way that exchanges have evolved and kind of the ecosystem has evolved, we now have the Lightning Network and some of these other layer 2 solutions that are being proposed. How do you foresee this altering the relationship between, block congestion, crime, and then maybe the price as well?
Well, I mean, I think certainly it reduces congestion, right? And so just as a straightforward implication, that would suggest that, it's not as clear of a check on breaches and frauds as it otherwise would be. Now, what's the magnitude of that? Probably pretty small, right? These breaches and frauds are so rare to begin with that we're not talking about big magnitudes in an absolute sense. But yeah, one of the benefits of these faster ways of making payments, right, is that it's a faster way of making payment. And it's a faster way for you and me, but it's also a faster way for criminals. And that's something we have to grapple with.
Yeah, and I think like it just highlights the inherent trade-offs in everything, right? So, the fundamental thing about how do we process all of these transactions? I mean, you hear this a lot, just with Bitcoiners debating, like, hey, suppose this does become like a global reserve asset, right? Like the amount of value that's going to be transferred is going to be significantly larger than it is right now. And how does that look on the blockchain? And so naturally, one thing that people are thinking about is they're thinking about, okay, well, how do we create like, these like second layer solutions? Because if it becomes that big, then then these blocks are going to be congested. Transaction fees are going to be very high, and that can potentially discourage people from wanting to use the network and make it cost prohibitive for certain people to use the network. Like somebody who's holding a very small amount of Bitcoin in a Bitcoin wallet somewhere might find that to transfer that Bitcoin wallet somewhere else, they have to pay the entire amount of Bitcoin that they have in a fee to a miner. And so people are very concerned about that, and as well they should be. But then in terms of the second layer solutions, like, relieving the congestion on, the base layer is going to come with, is going to come with costs. And so, in the event that Bitcoiners are right about, the Bitcoin becoming, some global reserve asset, in that sense, if lots of people around the world are using Bitcoin in day-to-day transactions, you're going to have these other solutions, and you're going to have people interacting outside of the base layer. But there's this transition period for you to get there, right? And during that transition period, there might be trade-offs with, well, reducing congestion on the base layer might also have costs, right? It's just, yes, you're getting this benefit of faster transactions. You're also getting this benefit of cheaper transactions on the base layer, at least in the short run. But then you're also getting, you're not having full blocks of transactions in that instance. And so in that transition, you just have to be cognizant of the trade-offs that you're that you're sort of making. But they're sort of unavoidable, right? Because you can't wait until 20% of the world's population is using Bitcoin to all of a sudden decide, like, we really need a second layer solution here. We should get to work on that, right? You sort of have to start ahead of time, and so it's just like these trade-offs are just sort of inherent to that development process.
I think that makes perfect sense. And I love talking to economists because it's always the trade-offs between everything, right? There's no perfect solution or silver bullet. So, we've gone over the kind of the key components of your paper. Are there any other parts that maybe I've left out, or that we, any key tenets that maybe it's worth discussing?
Well, I mean, one of the things I was thinking before we hopped on this call is just like, how cool is it that we're, Josh and I were both at nice universities where we have to do research as part of our job, and like we get to write.
Look how happy he looks about that.
Josh is also the department chair, so he has to do a bunch of other stuff that's not just writing on interesting things. But I think there's this. We've talked about this before, Renee. There's this perception in the Bitcoin community that, like economists are universally opposed to Bitcoin, things like that, which is apparently not true in this case, because we have two economists on the call here. But also, this work is going to get published in an academic journal. It's going to count for our research contributions and promotions. And so even beyond the few economists who are interested in Bitcoin, this is still considered valuable research, the kind of thing that economists should be working on. And I think that most Bitcoiners just aren't really aware of that. They kind of have this worldview where the economics profession is just opposed to Bitcoin, and anything of Bitcoin is seen as zero value, and that's just not the case. Perhaps those other economists don't give as much attention to Bitcoin as we would like, or perhaps they're too quick to dismiss. But nonetheless, right, they can recognize some valuable contributions and are not entirely dismissive of the kind of stuff Josh and I work on.
Yeah, I mean, before we started doing this, I came from teaching my Bitcoin class, and I kind of told them, like, on the first day, that it's kind of exciting to be able to teach the class, because I remember when I was, I remember writing about this stuff with Will, and lots of other people were like, I imagine Will got this as well. Lots of other people were like, "What are you doing? Why are you writing about this? Like, you need to get tenure. You need to write things that people are going to cite. Like who's going to be talking about this in 10 years?" And it turns out still us. But
also some other people.
Yes, but also some other people have come along. And so, but that's the thing, is it's it's an exciting thing to do. And I think like I think the thing about this paper is that it just kind of shows like the scope of questions that you can ask, because this is just one of those things where when we started having conversations about this, it sort of became like an obvious thing to test almost, right? Like, oh yeah, like why, like it's almost like why didn't we already think of that kind of thing, right? But it's but that just kind of is a testament to kind of the scope of questions that you can ask about Bitcoin. It's sort of the way I sold the class to my students, as I said, what we are doing is we are living through a massive, like, out of sample, event, right? So we have all this monetary theory, and we think that we know a lot about money and monetary theory and monetary history, but whenever you write down a theory is always informed by the world around you. And so you always have to be concerned that your theory, to the extent that your theory explains the world around you, well, your theory came from the world around you. So to what extent is this kind of circular, right? That like I observe something and then that works its way into my theory, which then explains what I observe. And so here, this is, what we really care about is out of sample predictions in economics, right? We care about, okay, we have this idea, we've tested this idea with the data that we have, but what happens when we get new data, right? Do the predictions still hold? And so Bitcoin is kind of this massive experiment. We never really get these kinds of experiments in monetary economics. I mean, there's a lot, we can go back historically and we can find historical things that look like experiments, but in real time, it's very hard to think about many things where you get this kind of large scale experiment. So as an academic, it's just very exciting to be able to think about this stuff and get paid to think about this stuff, and to, and to think about how the questions that you ask change over time. So everything that we kind of are thinking about today, I don't think that 5-10 years ago we would have ever thought that that's the question that we would be asking or something like that. And so I think that's another important thing about it. And so, yeah, to me, I think that this kind of stuff has value, and people should know that there are people like us who are out there trying to ask these questions and trying to learn more and trying to figure out what questions need to be asked in the first place.
Josh has always been more respectable than me, so I suspect you get a lot of questions early on. What are you doing? This can't be good for your career. I wrote my dissertation on the monetary system of Somalia, so I was always attracted to kind of the weird examples. So I suspect, perhaps because they had such low expectations of me, but there was far less surprise when I eventually started writing about Bitcoin. But to Josh's point, um, these out of sample predictions and being able to take them to the data is incredibly important. And sometimes it's because we get things wrong, and other times it's because we have a view of the world that, as Josh said, is informed by our experience of the world that is pretty close to the truth, but not quite there, right? It's not as precise as it could be. And when we get something new and different like Bitcoin, it enables us to kind of sand down our bad ideas, right? To find those imperfections in the views that we currently have and fix them, to repair them. And that doesn't necessarily mean you chuck everything and start anew, right? But you have to do some retrofitting. You have to realize that some of the things that you would have expected to happen didn't happen. So you got to kind of go back and find out, well, why is that? The thing that stands out in my mind, and actually I was just talking to my money and financial markets class about this week as well. So if you go back to 2007, 2008, 2009, and you asked me whether or not an item that had no commodity value, no one used it, right, for consumption purposes. You couldn't produce anything with it, right? You could only use it as a means of payments. Whether or not an item like that could gain acceptance, have a positive price without some government support. Right? Certainly we had examples of monies that looked like that in some sense that were circulating, right? The dollar, you can't eat that or use it to produce other things. You use it to make transactions, and that's it. But we can understand the dollar's demand, right? Both in a historical sense, it emerged out of a commodity. It was redeemable for gold, and then that redemption was suspended. But even if that hadn't happened, right, you have this big player, this big powerful force, the government, that is committed to making transactions in the dollar, requires tax payments in dollars. And so you can imagine how a money like that could get some demand, have a positive price. But without that big external player, can an item that initially nobody uses and is only valuable if other people are using it, and in the outset no one else is using it, can that kind of item get off the ground? Before Bitcoin, I would say no. And we don't have any examples of that. The examples of similar things circulating have this very obvious other force. And so, no, I would bet against that. But you can't bet against that when you've seen it happen. So immediately you realize, whoa, I've missed something here. Something that I didn't think was possible, I now see people using. And so you have to kind of figure out why you got that wrong and move from there. That's a lot of fun, right? We don't have that many experiments in monetary economics. We have these ideas that they kind of get smashed together because all of our examples are so similar. And so you really need something new and something different to tease out those more precise ideas.
I think a thing that we don't talk about enough that, I don't know, maybe we don't talk about it because what I'm going to say is maybe slightly unfair. But I mean, one of the things we don't talk about enough, right, is, to me, one of the things that was kind of surprising about other academics' attitudes towards Bitcoin is, like, I understood why they were opposed to it, or why they thought it would just fail, or why they thought this would just be some kind of fad that lasts for a few years and then nobody ever talks about it again. Like, I completely understand their perspective on that. But I never really understood, like, why they still wouldn't have academic interest, right? Like, even if you think it's going, like, in the early days, I mean, I know we've talked about this before. Like, I mean, I learned about Bitcoin for the first time in 2011. I didn't immediately think this is it, right? Like this is gonna be the new currency of the world. No, I mean, I thought it was really interesting, and I was just interested to see, like, could it gain traction? Would, like, what what are the properties of this thing? How likely is it for people to become interested in it? Like all that kind of stuff. And so for me, just like, I don't understand why more academics weren't interested in it for purely academic purposes, right? Like, let's just see what happens. Like, here's this new technology, and we've never really seen something like this before. Or at least we certainly haven't seen something like this before succeed. And so, could this be different? Could this be interesting? Why, but I think, like, part of the issue here is that if you were wrong about Bitcoin, it's very hard to change your mind now, because it comes with not only the baggage of, like, you predicting that no one was going to use it in 5 years, every 5 years, and 15 years later people are still using it. It's not only that, it's that, like, your prediction was not only wrong, but if you had just gotten this prediction right and you had bought Bitcoin, or because we're economists, if you had hedged your position and you had said, look, I think this is going to fail, but just in case it succeeds, maybe I'll buy a little bit, right? I think that actually matters, because I think, to the extent that some people still haven't developed the academic interest in it, who've known about it for a long time, I think it is actually tied to the opportunity cost of the foregone gains that they could have had. Not with everybody, but I do think that it's something that matters, because as an academic, I don't see how you can't just have an academic interest in it, even if you don't own it, even if you don't think that it will succeed, even if you don't care, about what happens to the price. There are lots of other things other than the price that are interesting that you should care about, and that you should just want to know, just purely out of the curiosity of being an academic. That's what you're supposed to do for a living, right? You're supposed to wrestle with ideas and use what you know to try to make predictions and understand what's going on. And so, as information changes, your perspective should change, your interest should change, and the sort of stubbornness of people not to change their position over time, independent of price. Just look at the fact that states are talking about owning Bitcoin. If that doesn't change your prior to thinking that, hey, maybe I should pay attention to this, I'm really not sure what's ever going to change it. And so that's the thing, though, that's been most confusing to me, is kind of like, why don't these people just have that typical academic interest in something that sort of would seem to me to be of obvious interest to anybody who studies monetary economics?
I guess I'll go a small step further and say, even at the outset, it's hard for me to understand how a monetary economist in particular couldn't be interested in Bitcoin, even if they expected it to fail. Right? It's still interesting. I am interested in these things called local currencies. And in some sense, a local currency is designed to fail. We define a money as a commonly accepted medium of exchange. And these local currencies are intended to only circulate in a small local economy, right? And so that's why I say they're designed to fail, right? They're designed to not become commonly accepted. And lots of places have tried to issue local currencies. They never work. We have lots of examples of failed local currencies, and yet it's interesting. I'm interested in why people are trying to do this, right? Precisely why it doesn't work. What drives that failure? Those are just interesting things, right? Most people, of course, aren't thinking about local currencies. But if you're a monetary economist and you come across some local currency, it's kind of hard for me to realize how you wouldn't say, like, why is that? What's
Yeah,
going
that
on
basic
there?
level of curiosity about it.
Yeah, right. It's like it's in the job description.
Yeah, exactly. You can
You see
be
all these
skeptical,
normal
but that's
monies
fine.
all the time. Here's a weird
Yeah,
money.
exactly.
Yeah, I'm interested. So even if you think that it's going to fail at the outset, even if you're, totally convinced it's going to fail, it's still interesting, right? And so deserves a little attention there, even at the outset.
Well, I think maybe we'll wrap there. So thank you so much, guys, for coming and talking about your paper and also these, positing about economics and a little teaser on your future work. So thank you.
Take
Thanks.
care.